Were you looking for some inspiration and you were curious about what's being built at the frontier of technology? You've come to the right place. Welcome to Thursday VC. My guest today has had a long career helping large pharmaceutical companies modernize drug discovery. He's previously held a role as the Executive Vice President of Research and Early Development, as well as Chief Science Officer at Novo Nordisk. And today, he's currently serving on the board of Cradle, an enterprise-grade AI platform for protein engineering. Now, as scientific and future-forward as that sounds, Marcus and we shared a panel in Gothenburg a couple of years ago. It's on the west coast of Sweden. And what struck me as we were discussing things that were looking so far out in the future was not only the depth of his scientific knowledge, but he was one of the rare few people who would stop to think, reflect, and then share something so deeply human about the journey to making things that are basically sci-fi. So you're in for a real treat today, and please join me in welcoming my guest. Hi, Marcus. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Marla, for the super kind introduction. Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
So from Gothenburg to trips that remind me of things, I was actually thinking of you very recently. Last week, I was in Oxford, and I got a few calls from friends saying that I should stop by Cambridge. And I remember that you actually started your journey there into science in Cambridge. You know, you meet people at the zenith of many things that they've achieved in their careers, but there was a version of you that was a young student wandering around the Cambridge lab, probably a little bit overwhelmed, surrounded by people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. What was that version of you most curious about? And when you look at the founders and scientists you work with today, the early ones, still figuring it out, do you still see a bit of yourself in them?
Yeah, wow, great question. Yeah, it obviously, zooms back many, many years back now, mid-90s. And by the way, actually, when I arrived in Cambridge to do my PhD, I'd already done probably 5.5 years of scientific education in Germany. I went through, at that time, a rather, long school system to get my high school degree. We had military service. So I actually arrived as what my boss then called a mature student, which I took as bit as an insult, I have to say. I was like 25 or so, but, I wasn't like the typical, I would say, UK undergrad where you have your bachelor in your pocket by the age of 20 or 21 and so forth. And that actually made quite a difference because I did have a chance to maybe reflect more on what is really important to me. I think what really spoke for me, and I think actually what got me the job, the PhD studentship, which was sponsored and supervised by a pharmaceutical company, was that I had experience working in a lab. I could actually do experiments and I could showcase that. I even had published my first little poster and stuff like that. And that was cool. But I think I was able to transmit that is this curiosity to experiment. Yeah, and I think this sits for me still at the very nature of being a scientist is, you try to understand how nature reveals itself through experimentation. Yeah, I mean, we can observe it, we can literally pull it under a microscope, but when you start to influence it, when you experiment with it, you get a deeper understanding. And I know maybe that sounds very philosophical, but I think that is at the very core of what drove and motivated me. Got there, and by the way, maybe I mentioned this here also, a journey which was very unlikely that I would ever go to university. I come, although I'm a, white male European, from a less privileged background. My parents had very little money. They actually didn't even go to high school.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I was the first generation, person in the family to ever do this. So I was short of role models and actually knowledge. I mean, internet wasn't really there yet. I had a book about what it means to study biology and pharmacology, but that was probably it. So arriving in Cambridge, where everybody seemed to know why they were there, what they were doing, they had pedigrees of important peoples coming before them, and it was very obvious to them why they were there and what they wanted to do. I think I felt both lost, excited, but maybe also it trickled a bit sort of my competitive nature to, I know it sounds a bit cheesy, to show the world that I can do this. Yeah. And I think that was a real booster for me to get there.
Interesting.
And if I look back now, it probably was one of the most formative times I've had in my career or even life.
I didn't realize that you didn't come from an academic family. I'm afraid that I bought into the stereotype that, academics then nudge their children and their families into these kinds of circles. And I think that's wonderfully empowering. It also makes me want to ask you something about the trends that we're seeing today. I don't actually judge in terms of right or wrong, but there's been a big backlash against higher education. A lot of voices on Twitter saying, don't get a PhD, don't go, it's not worth it. Go out and build. And there's definitely a dignity and a hunger to that. But I also find it equally curious that sounds like the same motivation for why you chose to stay. Would that be a strange parallel?
No, I think it's actually an interesting topic, I would say. First of all, I think education is a privilege, really. I mean, generations before us have worked hard to enable many people, us, to have a proper education. And in Germany, where I come from, education is free. So it is funded through the tax system as it is here in Sweden. And some people here in Sweden even get money to stay, with the CNS
Mm.
system and so forth, which I fundamentally believe is one of the biggest achievements we can have and maintain, rather than filtering who gets access through money. Fundamentally. Having said this, access is still regulated in some countries. Certainly in Germany, it is, as exactly as you say, much more likely that you go to university if your parents, if your grandparents have always been. So that seems to propagate.
Mm.
Through my upbringing, I would say to this very day, I root for the proverbial underdog, the people who haven't had it easy. And also, now those voices saying you don't need that education or you shouldn't have it, I'm sure there are other ways how you can achieve success and impact in your life. Absolutely. I think there are many good examples. My worry sometimes is that we focus on those good examples, but we actually don't talk about the millions of not so good examples.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I would be cautious to just dismiss an education as something that is no longer needed. However, and that's something I also did observe in Cambridge, if you just do it to have your title or
Right.
to have been to Cambridge or Harvard or Stanford or whatever you pick, and then walk away with a level of arrogance and box ticking,
An
I'm
entitlement.
an entitlement, exactly. Then I think it truly is time wasted, and it might still work in some systems where
Mm.
that actually works and gets you a job or a better paid job. I don't know, but I don't think that is the right reason to start or to even actually finish it. Because look, it's hard to go through a PhD, right?
Yeah.
It's time of uncertainty. You're poorly paid, if at all, right? And you have this hope that, okay, if I do this, then something great will come out. But I have also found, and maybe this is particularly true in science, it is a safe space to learn how to think and how to experiment, because you're not pushed so hard out in the world that you have to be successful. It is still a time of learning. It is a
Mm.
time of failing, and supervisors are there, people are there around
Mm.
you to help you. So honestly, I would not have wanted to miss it at all. If
Mm.
anything, not doing it and going out immediately into the world and facing whatever, venture capitalists, money people, I think that would have been probably quite disastrous for me.
I'm going to print a T-shirt for me that says "Money People." It's going to be my new.
They're good and not so good money people, but maybe we'll come to that later.
No, but I think what I hear and what I hope that people take with them is that you're really emphasizing that education has nothing to do with the degree or the qualification or the pedigree. It's the curiosity and the drive. And when you combine that with need to prove, perhaps, and to keep learning and push yourself into spaces. I wonder if that informed a little bit of your career to not just take a very safe route and simply do a job in a big company, but rather you went and you were working with the innovation side of these big companies, trying to push them to look beyond what was possible today. Tell me a little bit about that journey when you went with 2 decades at AstraZeneca, you were at Boehringer Ingelheim, Procedion, and then Novo Nordisk. What drove you in these different phases? Did you at any point during this arc feel like I've arrived?
Maybe we'll start with that. No. And I still haven't, right? And
Really?
now maybe my more visible or I don't know, overt career is behind me. I actually feel I'm just about to start. And I actually said it, I said with my children who are grown up, one of them is a scientist, and I said, for me, today is one of the most exciting times in science in the last 20 or 30 years. We had times in the area that I work in, cardiometabolic disease, where there was very little innovation. It was really hard to get new targets out, to work on something that could become important medicines. It's breakthrough. It's a lot of stuff happening. So I'm not done at all, and I actually think I know the road to myself once saying the journey is the journey, right? I mean, it's never over. There is no promised land also either, because you just continue. And if you're lucky, you can hand it over to somebody or to generations or the ones coming after you.
Mm.
So that is, I think, very fundamental for me also when I think, and I'm at that age where I'm allowed to think about legacy and what you do with what you have done in the past, but actually how you show up today and in the future. Which, by the
Mm.
way, is one of the reasons why at my more advanced age and experience, I'm actually quite interested in AI and what it means. I'm not an expert, but I actually am curious what it means, how to adopt, how to bake it in. I think you touched a bit on my journey, and I think it's fair to say I did have a more, I would say, cautious beginning and stepwise from my PhD, my then industrial supervisor, who, to be fair, was also one of my key role models because he was not only an academic at the University of Cambridge, he also was a very successful drug discoverer at Glaxo Wellcome at that time, and he brought a number
Mm.
of important medicines to people, including the first real powerful anti-migraine medicine, sumatriptan. And his name was Patrick Humphrey, and I admired his ability to be this scientific excellent person and at the same time, and I think that has stuck with me, do science that has a purpose. And I think this is for me where the bifurcation in the road happened very early on in my career, that doing science because it's interesting, and again, same as you, I'm not judging, that's fine, but it's not me. There's so many interesting things out there. I felt sometimes I might get lost. I wanted to do something that is interesting and actually has an effect. And an
Mm.
effect in my world to build, make, help invent novel therapeutics. Yeah. So I took a role when he offered me, but after a few years, I also realized, and I was still at Cambridge, I actually want to lead other people. And that is something, and that's an interesting reflection. Where does that come from? And is it innate? Is it in you? Is it learned? And maybe that's a very philosophical discussion. So basically, then I actually started looking for a job where, there were leadership roles on offer, and that landed me with Boehringer Ingelheim, went back to Germany, which was a bit of a journey after 6 years in Cambridge to more provincial Germany.
Culture shock?
Yeah, not so easy, I have to say. It was a great company to start your career in. I learned a lot. It was safe. It was maybe not very fast moving at the time, privately held by the family, which I really appreciated. But I also realized after a few years that I want to work at a faster pace and I would like to take more risk. And while I'm saying that, maybe that sounds odd, but I think I'd realized that driving novelty and innovation carries inherent risk and uncertainty. So I had to
Mm.
go somewhere else to push this. So I went to a biotech company, OSI Precision, headquarter in Long Island, US, but I went to their Oxford site to lead the research function there. And that was a fabulous time also to throw yourself into a biotech environment, close to the money people, of course, right? I mean, the ticker is always going, right? And in a small company, every
We're
day you
always
have
there.
results. It oscillates, a lot. But that was also an amazing time to see what you can do. And I think for the first time, I moved from being, I would say, a manager doing things that were right in front of me to becoming a leader, to paint a vision, to look into the proverbial bigger picture,
Hmm.
and also to realize in a smaller company, there's no one to inform you or even sometimes to hold you back. When you're in a reasonably senior position, you decide and things actually happen. And that is beautiful and,
Yeah.
of course, quite seductive.
Like, what's really fascinating now is how many people are leaning into this and see what that does for you as a person, going from, as you so cleanly distinguish between a manager to a leader. The two are not the same. People often conflate. titles with traits, which is not the
Mhm.
same thing. But you talked about risk and you talked about how that's just a prerequisite for innovation. I thought you did something very fascinating at Novo Nordisk. You had a failure mode that you described, which was letting AI grow in 1,000 uncoordinated directions, useful locally, fragmented organizationally. How do you actually build an AI capability that penetrates everything rather than sitting in silos?
Yeah, Maran, I think that's probably one of the most difficult questions and maybe one of the biggest tension spaces still in our industry is how you decide and maybe how you oscillate between those models who sit at the extreme, either totally democratize, decentralize, everybody does what they want and what they need, versus something that is, very central and basically then determines, I would say, the quality standards, the platforms that are being used across an enterprise or at least across an R&D organization. And to be honest, when we started in the early 20s, so not that long ago, and we didn't even call it ML or AI at that time, it was just a digital capability to start with,
Mm.
because we did come a bit from the Stone Ages. We still were working literally with the landlines. We simply needed to see what is useful for us. So we let loose a little bit to say, let scientists experiment and let's see what is actually useful for them. Put it in the hand of the users. Because I think that is really important in anything we're touching on today. How well is that user interface actually working? Because we can build the best platforms. If no one uses it or they hate it, or they have to go through I don't know how many steps to actually understand what they're doing, people will just not do it.
Mm.
Yeah, so that was, I think, very concrete, very pragmatic. But we also realized at some point in time, we needed to channel investments. We needed to move from fragmented collaborations to something that ensures a reasonable level of quality. To be fair, also data security, because
Mm.
when you move from a pure exploration space to something that gets closer to value, molecular design of the molecules that when they grow up, one day they might be drugs, right? So there's stuff you want to protect, patient data and so forth. And then also, of course, to scale it and not have it as sort of anecdotal handheld pieces. So we built an organization, digital organization, and that actually went to the full extreme by growing capability, hiring people, building departments, and building, I would say, an elite organization. And they were really great, except to some degree on their journey, they forgot they had customers and users. Yeah, so literally the pendulum swung to one extreme, and then we had to put in some measures in place to say, okay, now we maybe need to integrate in a strategic and daily working way the users with the platforms and vice versa. We started talking about bi or trilingual co-workers, people who understand science and the digital world.
Mm.
And trilingual if you also understand the business economics of what you're
Mm.
doing.
Mm.
Yeah, and so we started to develop talent and recruit talent along those lines. And I think that's what, we basically started to build and rolled out by the time that I left, where we had then put data and digital and AI at the very core of everything that we did as a central unit from which science would flow and be informed. And I still maintain that is probably not a bad model of how we should think about it.
No, I agree. And if anything, I think the so-called AI native companies that start with this, trilingual core from day zero, where they're not retrofitting AI into an organization. They're building a product that is inherently built with AI at the core. The organization is built with that into its leadership, into its template. And here, you and I have talked a little bit in the world of biology. Even for AI native companies, we've talked about the importance of the wet lab to complement AI. There is a temptation, and I think especially for money people or investors, to think that if the model is good enough, the physical tether is really just optional. Do you think that's right?
Well, first of all, the model isn't good enough, right? And
Mm.
I think that's maybe we should start. And by the way, maybe I'll take a step back. The conversations I had with, you mentioned Cradle, where I sit on the advisory board. I also work with one other company, Causally. Both CEOs are, I would say, confident in their abilities, but they're also humble enough to know what they don't know. Yeah, and the human body, disease, biology is not only complicated, it's also complex. And I'm sometimes wondering whether it's right when people say we can reduce it to an engineering problem. Maybe, but it is very, very complex engineering, because I think we have many more feedback loops and interactions than probably you have in your standard engineering problem. We simply do not have the tools yet to generate the data to understand those complexities. And because we cannot generate those data, my worry would be that then the machine makes up data that may or may not exist, right? And uses that as a substrate for a model refinement, which then might simply self-propagate and lead us into something that's not there. So I would say, and maybe this is also a biggest challenge with investors who don't understand biology, because biological risk is not just the same risk as you have in tech. I mean, you can rewrite your code. You just bring out a different prototype and you see whether it works. That's a bit harder for us. Yeah. Right, because I mean, the biological risk is actually the one that you fundamentally got it wrong, and your hypothesis about how the human body works and how disease starts, progresses, and has detrimental effect is wrong. And in our world, we don't know this usually until a phase 3 readout. So after 7 to 10 years down the line with traditional methods, where we will know this medicine actually made a meaningful difference. And I
I
think
think
that is the fundamental challenge with this area. While it holds a massive opportunity to model, and I'm a great fan to model, and I do think everything that can be predicted on safe grounds will be predicted by the machine better and faster than we can do it.
Mhm.
But we will constantly have to refine and feed the model and validate the model through wet lab experimentation, and that will get more and more sophisticated. Today we're doing maybe binding of molecules to their target. Tomorrow it will be cellular models. The
Mm.
day after it might be more sophisticated models. And I think this interplay is required for, I would argue, still some time to come.
I agree. I think I would draw a parallel that it's basically trying to paint a picture, and you have maybe a few colors in your hand, and you think you're fully armed because you look at all the colors that you're holding, and then you don't realize you're colorblind and you don't have any idea of what you're not even seeing. I don't know how many times we've set about to investigate pathway. It's such a misleading name, pathway. It implies a nice little linear, maybe a circular little track that the protein takes, right? And you have no idea who's hiding in the bushes. So you go about trying to cure one thing and you cause 6 other diseases because you had no idea how things are interacting. Not again to say that this is not exactly the kind of complexity that would benefit from AI and maybe quantum enabled computing. Of course it is. But I just want to emphasize that what you're saying is human in the loop, lab in the loop, send a ship out into the ocean if you're going to sail it. Don't just guess where you're headed. And I think that's very fair. But you said something about biology risk, and I actually want to touch on that. A lot of VCs that I meet, they're famously afraid of biology risk and they're really scared of the time to market. But I'm seeing an amazing blossoming community of some of the founders that you mentioned, both very knowledgeable but humble in what they don't know and technically building with AI and life sciences. How do we bridge? What is it that you think keeps them up at night that wouldn't keep a regular software investor up at night if they wanted to invest in AI and life science?
And in a funny kind of way, I've always been an internal investor because I was a decision maker sitting on a reasonably large budget in the companies I worked in and running tens, in my last job, more than 100 programs at any given point in time. So I too had to decide, where to best use the company's, the shareholders' money. And one of my biggest challenges has always been, and maybe it's very high level, is whenever we faced a black box, because you don't actually know what's happening. And then people say, well, we just need to run the experiment and hope for the best. I don't like hope as part of your strategy or luck. They might happen, there might be things, right? But it's very hard to implement and scale this. So
Mm.
what I try to do is actually disentangle this pathway or this journey into stepping stones. And I've sometimes used the analogy, for me, it is like going or driving through fog. Right? To do this safely, you do as far as your headlights can actually clearly see. And if you're driving too fast, that's really risky. So you do something that you shouldn't be doing. You just hope that there's no one there, there's no obstacle in your way, and there's no bend around. Right? If you're driving too slow, you'll never get there. You might as well walk. Right? So
Right.
finding that space. So what are the stepping stones then on their way? Which leads me to understanding the patient population you're working in. What is actually happening in those patients? What biology is particular in play when you think about the treatment you would like to give them? What are the biomarkers that you could discover along the way? And I think this is where the machine is uniquely positioned to find the smallest changes in patterns, the smallest signals, and not just a singular signal, but potentially an interplay of signals to say, "Okay, you're starting to move the needle on biology by intervening in this system here." And I think the moment I had something in my hand where I say, okay, we're going in the right direction or in the wrong direction, because then I need to take a step back, that's actually great. And you can do this in a very stepwise fashion. And that actually brings me to an analogy I like to have, I've pushed that a lot to my teams, is from design thinking is think about clinical trials as minimal viable products.
Mm.
Just get us as far as, we can. We don't have to launch it, but it gives us something that we're going to learn from. And once you think about a chain of those MVPs as learning cycles, as fast learning cycles, and again, supported by the machine and going very fast, I think we're going to disrupt this linear time frame of 7 to 10 years to market fundamentally.
To what do you think it would, from 7 to 10 years to
Fewer.
very scientifically grounded answer?
Well, let me. I don't have an answer, but here's one thing I have often thought about. And I want to go back to COVID, right? And not
Mm.
to, have it again, but think about from the discovery of the virus, from the structure of the virus, to actually making medicines, particularly through a platform technology that was uniquely suited, i.e. mRNA therapeutics, was less than a year.
Right.
Right? It was less than a year, and then we had launched somewhere north of 10 billion doses a few months after this. It worked because regulators also, in an emergency situation, said, okay, we don't maybe know all the risks with it, but we will actually look at those risks as we roll the medicine out. So your phase 3 trial became a bona fide real-world evidence trial, a post-launch event where you then would collect safety data. I'm not advocating this is how we do all pharma, but there is something that has worked, and we
Right.
could treat billions of patients with an important medicine in a very, very short period of time. And I'm a bit frustrated that we have seemingly forgotten all of the things that we have done in this time, all of those learnings that we had, and we're basically back to where we were before.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's entirely feasible. Whether we want it is a different thing, right? But this is actually, I think, more a societal discussion. Which risk are you willing to take as a society? If on one hand you can have an important medicine for many of you, but maybe we don't know whether the safety actually over years to come will hold true. Because the biggest time element in drug discovery is the phase 3 trial, which is 3-4 years sometimes. Yeah.
Right. So you're saying that we proved we could drive a little faster in this fog, and now we've slowed down again. And it's a real shame because we are right now seeing additional tools and kits and diagnostics and approaches from organoids to you name it, AI enabled, AI native, that could actually de-risk some of the reasons we think we need to slow down again. So that's a real irony and a real shame.
Not to put too much, negative energy in here, but if you look at it, if you look at all the numbers, drug discovery has become more expensive and less productive than it used to be, despite all our technology advances,
Hmm.
right? Which is also probably some of the maybe hesitancy on a bad day, I would say cynicism that many scientists in pharmaceutical or in science have towards AI, because they're saying, well, we've seen many of those so-called revolutions, big data, the genomics in the 2000s, recombinant technologies. None of them have really disrupted what we do. Now, I would argue it's different. It's fundamentally different what we're seeing now, because the rate of adoption and I think the rate of change is on a scale that we have never experienced before.
Mm.
Yeah, but I think we also still need to see enough proof that it actually works. I'm a bit concerned that we're not using right now AI in the right way. We're putting sometimes the bar too high, or we're deploying it to the wrong things. And sometimes we're also trying to disprove that it's actually useful and or a threat, rather than actually, to defining, as you say, AI native, not only companies, but workflows
Hmm.
to make it really, really work to our advantage.
One of the companies that's, I think, tackling this very well is Cradle that you've named. Before we go into what Cradle is, some of the listeners probably don't have a biology background or think that it's not for them. If you had to explain it to a non-scientist why engineering a better protein matters for their life, not in an abstract way, but very concretely, what would you tell them?
So first of all, proteins are the important elements in our body who have a number of functions. They so-called catalyze reactions. So they make one thing from a substrate, which is important for our body. They might be structural proteins. So they basically provide support for, our shape, our organs. They might be receptors. So they're sensing the outside world. So they're fundamental pieces actually of our biological systems that we need, and they're either within the cells or on the surface of cells. So they're everywhere. Now, the fun part about nature is it had about, 3 to 4 billion years to make the best proteins, we can think of, which are the ones maybe we're carrying today through evolution. So that's actually tough competition. Right. In particular, if you think about that, maybe we started, I don't know, 100 years ago to make better proteins than nature has engineered. I actually personally still find it amazing that we can do this.
I
For me, it's a
agree.
testament to human ingenuity that we can go in with a rational approach and say, okay, this protein is important or this peptide, but the human body has engineered it so it has, for example, a very short half-life. It does its effect, but it only lives in my blood for a few minutes. What if it was circulating for a day? Could it do an even better job? And at the end of the day, that is one of the hypotheses behind the GLP-1s. We always knew it was an important molecule to regulate satiety and blood glucose, but it's also very rapidly cleared through the human body. So half-life of about 2 minutes. If you have diabetes, then actually it's not enough and you want it to act longer. But how humans have done it, they have done, I would say in very simple terms, one modification at a time. And then we run experiments, and then we give it to animals, then we give it to humans, and then we find, okay, that kind of worked. And on a good day, we have launched a drug.
Hmm.
What the machine can do, it actually can parallel process an unspeakable number of potential changes,
Mm.
compare and model whether those would work, compare it to other proteins who might have similar mutations. And I think this vast number of options, of opportunities being tried and tested, being compared is frankly beyond human cognition. I mean, our brains are simply not meant to cope with those numbers. And this is, I think, the machine literally as a machine can churn. And it does so very, very quickly. And of course, it's all statistics and in a way not different to what we know now from the large language model, which is a statistical formula to say, okay, we know 3 words and we think about, or the machine thinks about, what is the most likely word that comes in position number 4.
Pattern recognition,
Pattern
exactly.
recognition. And that's no different in protein engineering. It tries to find the best pattern, how your protein should look like to do its job well or to move towards the desired outcome. And now, obviously, we're seeing platforms evolving who are geared towards doing this with high precision and find that quite interesting with high scalability and breadth. So no matter which protein you're trying to engineer, these platforms are useful. And that's a real shift from a singleton success to something that is universally applicable.
So more effectiveness, more precision in the medicine, perhaps more personalization of this medicine. I think, what a time to be alive where we have people with both the audacity and the ability to take what's already, I think, gravity-defying, such as taking your own code, your own protein code, and making it better, but to do that at this scale. I'm incredibly impressed by the talent that is coming. And I think as these companies grow and perhaps recruit, and you talked about leadership, I hope that some of the people that join step off to build something else that was sparked during their time and their journey with Cradle and companies like that. If I take that sort of as our last question, if you were to give a bit of advice to maybe a scientist who is like you were on your first day in Cambridge, in a space that they weren't fully aware or sure they belong to, but with pockets full of dreams, really, really big ones, what should they build towards?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think you also put it quite rightly that yesterday's innovation is, today's old news. And what medicines have done, they simply have re-baselined. They will be seen as what we call the standard of care. So everybody who needs it should, if they choose to do so, get those medicines. Which, by the way, actually is a great thing, but also a challenge for science because we're now just raised the bar.
Mm.
So your ideas need to be, so what is indeed next, and not just different, but potentially beyond and on top of what you have. And I do think it's Henri Thoreau who said, most people live their lives in quiet desperation. I have always found that trying to get rid of professional fear has been very important for me. I have very many personal fears of heights and all of those things, but to not be fearful of starting something, to say, I have an idea, then you shouldn't be, I would say, foolish to only fall in love with the idea. Surround yourself with wise counsel, surround yourself with people who really challenge you and tell you this is a real bad idea. And then you have a dialogue with them to say, okay, and how would I convince you that this is actually a great idea? Yeah, which leads you on to the next important key experiment to move forward. It's very tempting to work with the people that like you. I think it's more important to work with the people that challenge you. Yeah, and I think that is something fundamentally for me that I've always tried to do is choose the hard way and not the easy way to move forward. But have your vision out there. I think be clear on your purpose and what you try to achieve and what you want to do. And I think having this North Star helps one immensely to actually, move difficult times because in the world in drug discovery, there are setbacks. I still don't know whether I call, scientists, that don't work out as failures. If you designed it well, you will have hopefully learned something from it and you moved forward. But I would often say also to new leaders, if somebody has hired them, forget about your imposter syndrome. Somebody has trusted you. Somebody has chosen you to do this role and they see something in you. If you don't know what it is, go and ask them. And that's actually a good starting point. And look for the people around you who support you and help you on your journey. And I think that's probably always been important and will be important no matter what technology or what environment you're choosing. But I would hope that most people try and find something that, makes a difference.
Lean into your curiosity. Use science that actually makes a difference and not just satisfies a curiosity. Surround yourself with people that push you and then challenge the status quo. I think that is so incredibly inspiring. And I know that everyone who's been listening has appreciated it as much as I have. Thank you, Marcus, for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you so much, Marla.
That's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here again in a few days where we explore other themes in frontier technology, physical AI, and the people behind them at Thursday VC.